The world tasted of mud and metal. Sucking mud, clinging to her worn leather boots with each desperate movement. The storm hadn't broken, hadn't even lessened its fury. It simply was. A relentless, gray weight pressing down on everything. Rain lashed at her face, stinging her eyes, mixing with the tears she hadn't yet fully acknowledged. The wagon lay splintered, a ribcage of broken wood exposed to the wrath of the Wyoming weather. Supplies, flour, blankets, a chipped porcelain doll, were scattered across the ravaged landscape, swallowed by the deepening puddles. Papa's strongbox, usually secured under the seat, had burst open, spilling its meager contents onto the soaked earth. Papa! Her voice was small, lost in the roar of the wind and the drumming rain. She knelt beside him, the mud cold and yielding beneath her knees. He was slumped against the remains of the seat, his face pale and slack. She pressed her ear to his chest, a frantic, childish gesture. Nothing, just the relentless rhythm of the storm. Papa, she pleaded again, a desperate tremor in her voice. He hadn't spoken since the first violent gust had ripped through the prairie, overturning the wagon, sending them tumbling into the chaos. She remembered his shout, a brief, powerful command to brace themselves, and then nothing. She tried to lift his head, her small hands struggling with the weight. He was a large man, strong and weathered, a man who had faced down mountains and rivers and harsh winters. Now he was still. Her fingers trembled so violently she could barely keep her grip. He felt cold, shockingly cold, even through the thick wool of his coat. A memory flickered, the way the sun had bronzed his skin, a stark contrast to her own pale complexion, a trait she'd inherited from her mother, a woman she barely remembered. She always felt the chill deeper than he did, always needed an extra blanket. "Please, Papa," she sobbed, her voice cracking with grief. "Please wake up." She tugged at his arm, a futile gesture, and then began to shake him gently, then with increasing desperation. His body didn't respond. The rain plastered strands of dark hair across her face, blinding her. A sob racked her small frame, and then another, until she was consumed by a wave of grief so profound it stole her breath. She pressed her face into his shoulder, the rough wool scratching her skin. He smelled of rain and wood smoke and nothingness. The world narrowed to the relentless gray of the storm, the smell of wet earth, and the crushing weight of her loss. She was alone, utterly, devastatingly alone, on the vast, unforgiving prairie. A small, fragile figure lost in a landscape that didn't care for her grief, or her fear, or her desperate pleas. The storm raged on, indifferent to the broken heart of a little girl. The canvas was ripped, a skeletal frame against the gray sky. Splintered wood littered the muddy ground, smelling of rain and something else, something sweet and sickening. He hadn't seen a wreck this complete in years. Usually, there were signs of a struggle, scattered belongings, a lost animal. This felt like the prairie had simply swallowed the wagon whole. He knelt, ignoring the sucking mud, and assessed. One dead horse, mercifully quick. Supplies scattered and ruined. And the girl. She was small, shockingly pale against the dark earth. Maybe 10 summers. Her face was streaked with mud and tears, red-rimmed eyes fixed on something beyond the wreckage. She hadn't cried out, hadn't even flinched when he approached. A stillness settled over him, a familiar weight in his chest, not quite sorrow, but a recognition of loss. He'd seen it too many times on these plains. "Girl," he said, his voice rough from years of wind and silence. "You all right?" She didn't respond, just continued to stare. He reached out a calloused hand, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. She was shivering, teeth chattering. "What's your name?" Still nothing. He tried again, softer this time. "What's your name, little one?" A whisper, barely audible above the rain. "Alara. Alara. Just Alara." She nodded, a tiny movement. He pulled off his own worn oilskin coat and draped it around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and leather, and hopefully, some warmth. She didn't react. Cold. Another nod. He examined her quickly, checking for obvious injuries. A few scrapes, but nothing broken. He rummaged through the wreckage, finding a dented tin cup and a half-empty canteen. He offered her water. She took it, her hand trembling, and drank slowly. He surveyed the wreckage again. Nothing salvageable beyond a few blankets and a damaged doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained. He picked it up and offered it to her. She took it without a word, clutching it tightly. It was a pathetic offering, but it was all he had. He could find no other survivors. He hadn't expected to. The storm had likely claimed them quickly. He knelt before her, his gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. There was nothing here, only the relentless rain and the vast, unforgiving prairie. He couldn't bring back her father. He couldn't mend her broken heart. But he could keep her alive. That, at least, was something. He shifted, bracing against the chill, and said, "We need to move. There's an abandoned shack a few miles west. Better than staying here." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply extended a hand, calloused and strong. She stared at it for a long moment, then slowly, tentatively, placed her small hand in his. The sun, a brassy disk, climbed higher, promising another scorching day. He hadn't bothered with a proper breakfast. A swig of lukewarm coffee and a strip of dried meat was enough. He checked the lashings securing the meager supplies to his horse, a roan named Dust. Less for her, he figured. She wouldn't last a mile pushing a full pack. Didn't matter. She carried little beyond that cracked doll and the threadbare blanket. He'd salvaged a smaller saddle from the wreckage, barely fitting it to the pony he'd found grazing nearby. She was perched awkwardly, clutching the horn as if it were a lifeline. Her pale skin, shockingly white against the brown of the prairie, seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. It gave her an ethereal, fragile look, like a moth caught in the vastness. He resisted the urge to glance back, to see if she was still upright. Best to let her find her own balance. He rode in silence, conserving his energy and his words. Words were a luxury he rarely afforded. He checked the rifle, running a calloused thumb over the smooth barrel. Needed to be ready. Bandits, wolves, the unpredictable Wyoming weather. The prairie offered a dozen ways to die. He packed the remaining jerky and a small pouch of coffee beans into a saddlebag, ignoring the pang of resentment at sharing his dwindling stores. This wasn't charity. It was a debt, a repayment for a life he hadn't asked to save. "Keep your weight centered," he grunted, glancing sideways. She swayed with the horse's gait, a wobbly rhythm that threatened to unseat her. "Don't fight it. Move with the horse." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the ground rushing past. He could almost feel her fear radiating off her, a cold, subtle tremor in the air. A few hours bled into a monotonous rhythm of hooves and wind. He checked the map again, tracing the route to Fort Laramie with a dirt-stained finger. Another 2 days, if they were lucky. Another 2 days of this responsibility. Suddenly, a startled cry, a brief flailing of arms, and a thud. He wheeled around to see her tumbling sideways, landing awkwardly in the tall grass. Dust shied, nearly throwing him. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking into the dry earth. She lay still for a moment, her face pale, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The doll had flown from her grasp, landing a few feet away. He knelt beside her, checking for broken limbs. Nothing obvious, just a scraped knee and a bruised elbow. "Clumsy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. It wasn't meant to be unkind, merely factual. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the already hazy landscape. He didn't offer comfort. He simply extended a hand, calloused and strong. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and grasped it, her small fingers surprisingly firm. He pulled her to her feet, ignoring the tremor that ran through her body. "Best get back on," he said, his voice gruff, "and try not to fall again." He retrieved the doll, brushing off the dirt and handing it back to her. She clutched it tightly, as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. The long journey continued. The fort smelled of stale beer, horse sweat, and something indefinably worn. Not the clean wear of honest labor, but the clinging grime of desperation. Malik tasted it on the back of his tongue, a gritty film that settled with the dust motes dancing in the meager sunlight filtering through the rough-hewn timbers. Fort Laramie wasn't a haven. It was a pressure valve, crammed with men trying to outrun something: the winter, the law, or their own ghosts. He kept a hand lightly on Alara's shoulder, guiding her through the press of bodies. She'd fallen silent, her small fingers clutching the worn fabric of her dress, her gaze fixed on the rough-planked ground. The doll, normally her constant companion, remained tucked under her arm, forgotten for the moment. He hadn't realized how much she relied on the simple reassurance of his touch. Each time a burly man jostled past, she instinctively pressed closer, a fragile bird seeking shelter from a storm. He found Administrator Abernathy's office, a cramped space smelling of pipe tobacco and dried ink. The man himself was a mountain of a fellow, with a face like weathered granite and eyes that missed nothing. He barely glanced up from the ledger he was meticulously scribbling in. "Trapper," he grunted, acknowledging Malik's presence without invitation. "Found a girl, sir. Wagon wrecked in the storm 3 days back. Lost her father. Needs care." Malik kept his tone deliberately neutral. He hadn't anticipated resistance, but Abernathy radiated a cold practicality that made his gut tighten. Abernathy finally lifted his gaze, his eyes sweeping over Alara. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossed his face. "Another one? We're overrun as it is. What makes you think I can take on another mouth to feed?" "She's quiet. Doesn't take much." A useless statement, Malik knew. What did any child take but care? Quiet don't fill bellies. Got no relatives? No one to claim her. Malik shook his head. "None that I could find. Just the doll. And a small, silver locket." Abernathy snorted. "Sentimental trinkets. Worthless. Look, Trapper, I'm not running an orphanage. Fort Laramie is a military post, not a charity. You found her, you deal with it." He returned to his ledger, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. A surge of protectiveness, hot and unwelcome, washed over Malik. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remain calm. He hadn't expected benevolence, but the man's callousness still struck him as excessive. He hadn't expected this complete lack of human decency. He glanced down at Alara. She hadn't met Abernathy's gaze, her eyes downcast. Her small shoulders trembled slightly. She hadn't spoken a word since they'd entered the fort. He could feel the weight of her fear, her uncertainty. She was a wisp of a thing, easily broken. "She won't be a burden, sir," Malik said, his voice low but firm. "I just need a few days, time to make arrangements." Abernathy didn't even look up. A few days turn into weeks, weeks into months. "I've heard it all before. You trappers are a transient lot. You'll be gone with the first snow, leaving her to us." Malik fought to keep the anger from his voice. "I'll find someone. A family. A rancher, perhaps." A lie he knew. Finding a home for a fatherless, pale child in this unforgiving land would be near impossible. But he couldn't tell Abernathy the truth, that he had no idea what he was going to do. Abernathy finally sighed, a sound like wind whistling through a canyon. "Fine. A week. 1 week. Then she's my problem." He gestured towards the door with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Now get out. You're blocking the light." The fort receded into a shimmering haze, a cluster of rough-hewn logs swallowed by the vastness of Wyoming. Each hoofbeat of his horse, Jericho, echoed the finality of his decision. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since leaving, and Alara hadn't uttered a single one. She clung to him, a fragile weight against his back, her small hands gripping the worn leather of his coat. Jericho's steady rhythm was a counterpoint to the grit grinding beneath the hooves, the rasp of wind against exposed skin. The air smelled of dry sage and something older, something mineral and ancient. He could feel the sun leaching the moisture from his lips, tightening the skin across his knuckles. He'd chosen the tenderest cuts of jerky, stowing them in her small pouch. Not for charity. Practicality. She needed strength for the journey. He scanned the horizon, a habit ingrained from years of tracking and scouting. Granite peaks clawed at the cloudless sky, their shadows stretching long and skeletal across the plains. A hawk circled lazily, a dark speck against the fading blue. He'd head towards the foothills, towards the small cabin nestled in a stand of pines. A solitary life, but a safe one. Hold tight. He grunted, more to break the silence than to offer any real comfort. Her small body shifted slightly against his. He hadn't anticipated this. A child. A responsibility he hadn't asked for, hadn't wanted. He'd find someone. A family. A rancher with a wife and sturdy sons. That was the plan. He tasted dust on his tongue. He adjusted the weight of his rifle, the familiar feel of the wood and steel a small comfort. He told himself he was simply minimizing loss. A quick find, a stable home. It was a kindness, really, not sentiment. Sentiment was a weakness. Hours blurred into a landscape of ochre and fading light. He allowed Jericho to follow the old game trails, a natural route through the uneven terrain. The setting sun painted the clouds in streaks of crimson and gold, a momentary beauty in a harsh land. He'd chosen the high ground, a small plateau overlooking a narrow canyon. He dismounted, carefully lifting Alara down. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and he instinctively steadied her. He avoided her gaze, busying himself with securing Jericho to a scrubby juniper. "We'll camp here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He busied himself with gathering dry wood, the snap of branches echoing in the gathering dusk. He felt her watching him, a silent presence at his back. He forced himself to ignore it. He'd get her fed, sheltered, and then he'd begin to truly figure out how to fulfill his obligation. He offered her a piece of jerky. She took it with small, hesitant fingers, her eyes fixed on the darkening landscape. He watched her chew, a slow, deliberate motion. The plan felt less solid than it had hours ago. A tightness settled in his chest, an unfamiliar weight. He told himself it was fatigue. The high altitude. The relentless sun. The cabin smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, a scent that clung to the back of Alara's throat. It wasn't a welcoming scent, not exactly, but it was solid, real, unlike the vast, shifting emptiness of the plains she dimly remembered. The logs felt rough beneath her fingertips as she traced the gaps between them, trying to block the chill that seeped into her bones despite the early sun. Silas hadn't offered comfort, only instruction. Gather kindling, dry stuff, and don't waste time admiring the trees. She'd tried, clumsily, to build a fire. Stacked twigs collapsed. Damp leaves smoldered instead of caught. Her hands, unused to such labor, ached. He hadn't raised his voice, but his corrections were sharp, precise. Strike harder. Keep your elbow locked. You're wasting effort. It wasn't about the fish, not really. It was about competence, about proving she wasn't a burden. She tried again, mimicking his movements, the flint sparking against steel. A wisp of smoke. Then another. Finally, a fragile flame flickered to life. He didn't praise her, only said, "See to it doesn't go out." The next task was tracking. He led her into the woods, pointing out barely discernible prints in the soft earth. Deer, not fresh, but good practice. She stumbled over roots, her gaze sweeping the forest floor, desperately trying to distinguish between the myriad of impressions. Hours passed. She found only rabbit tracks, and even those she almost missed. He sighed, a sound like whine through the pines. "You're looking at the ground, not reading it." He showed her again, pointing out the subtle shift in the soil, the broken twig, the faint indentation. She copied his movements, concentrating fiercely. Still, she missed things. A fleeting glimpse of a pheasant. The subtle scent of fox. Frustration tightened her chest, but she pressed on. Fishing proved no easier. The stream rushed cold and swift, slick with moss. He handed her a crude fishing rod, a length of willow branch and twine. Patience, and a steady hand. She cast the line, the hook landing clumsily in a tangle of branches. Again, and again, her knuckles were white from gripping the rod. Her muscles burned. He stood behind her, his presence a silent weight. He didn't offer help, but subtly adjusted her grip, showed her how to angle the rod, how to feel the pull of the current. Then, a tug, a sharp, unexpected jerk. She nearly lost her balance, stumbling forward. Silas steadied her, his hand briefly brushing her arm. "Hold tight," he said, his voice lower, perhaps even softer than usual. She reeled in the line, her arms trembling with effort. A silver trout flashed in the sunlight. It wasn't a large fish, but it was hers. She landed it on the bank, the trout flopping weakly. A small smile touched her lips. It wasn't about the fish, not entirely. It was about the quiet persistence, the refusal to give up. It was about finally, after so long, feeling a flicker of competence, a spark of hope in this harsh, unforgiving land. She looked up, expecting a reprimand, an instruction. Instead, Silas simply nodded, a barely perceptible movement of his head. "Good," he said. The trading post reeked of wood smoke, sweat, and something vaguely feral. A cacophony of shouts, bartering, and rough laughter assaulted her ears. Malik kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the churned mud between her worn boots. The smells, the sounds, everything pressed in, suffocating her. She clung to Silas's arm, her fingers digging into the rough wool of his sleeve. He didn't offer reassurance, didn't pull away, simply remained a solid, immovable presence beside her. They were here for salt, flour, and a new length of rope. Silas conducted his business with terse efficiency, exchanging pelts for supplies with the post's owner, a burly man named Hemlock. The other men, trappers and traders mostly, cast curious glances their way. Malik was an anomaly in this rough world, pale-skinned, with hair the color of a raven's wing, a fragile blossom struggling to survive in a field of thorns. A low murmur began to ripple through the small crowd. She didn't need to look up to know she was the subject of their scrutiny. Then a voice, thick with scorn, cut through the noise. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. A ghost, I reckon. Or maybe Silas finally found himself a wife who ain't afraid of a little dirt." Another man chuckled. "She looks like she'd faint at the sight of a rabbit, let alone a grizzly." Malik's cheeks burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the sound to stop, the judging stares to disappear. Silas didn't immediately respond. He finished weighing the salt, his movements slow and deliberate. Then, without turning, he spoke, his voice a low growl that carried easily over the din the salt. Hemlock, clearly uncomfortable, quickly completed the transaction. The taunts continued, growing bolder. "She wouldn't last a day on the trail, I wager. Probably never even seen a horse before." Silas finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the group. It wasn't an angry glare, not exactly. It was something colder, more assessing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture. He simply looked at them, and in that look was a silent promise of something unpleasant. The men shifted uneasily under his scrutiny. The laughter died down, replaced by a nervous silence. "A man's company is his own concern," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And mine doesn't require commentary." The lead heckler, a burly man with a scarred face, attempted a defiant grin. "Just stating facts, Silas." Silas took a single step forward. The movement wasn't aggressive, but it was enough to make the man falter. "Facts are like stones, best left unturned." The man's grin vanished. He mumbled something under his breath and turned away. The others followed suit, avoiding Silas's gaze. He turned back to Malik. He didn't offer a word of comfort, didn't pat her hand. He simply adjusted the pack on her shoulder, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of assistance. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. The humiliation stung, but beneath it, a fragile hope flickered. He hadn't dismissed her, hadn't pretended the taunts hadn't happened. He had defended her, not with grand gestures or flowery words, but with a quiet, unwavering strength. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The buck thrashed, a shudder running through its muscular frame. Silas hadn't wasted a moment, already assessing the wound, a deep gash along its flank, bleeding freely. Malik knelt beside him, trying to keep the animal calm, her hands trembling despite her efforts. She'd insisted on helping, on proving she wasn't just a burden, a clumsy liability always requiring assistance. It had been foolish, reckless even. She hadn't accounted for the buck's frantic strength, the sharp curve of its antlers. A searing pain bloomed on her palm. She gasped, instinctively drawing back her hand. Blood welled between her fingers, a bright, coppery scent mingling with the pine and damp earth. It wasn't a deep cut, but it stung, a sharp, insistent throb that echoed in her skull. Silas didn't look at her, didn't offer a word of concern. He simply reached for his knife, his movements precise and economical. He dispatched the buck quickly, efficiently. It wasn't merciful, not in the sentimental sense, but it was respectful, a swift end to suffering. Then, finally, his gaze shifted to her hand. He didn't flinch, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply knelt beside her, his shadow falling across the wound. He took a strip of clean linen from his pack, already dampened with cool water. He didn't ask if it hurt. He didn't tell her to be careful. He simply began to cleanse the wound, his touch surprisingly gentle. The cold water shocked her nerves, momentarily stealing her breath. She clenched her jaw, refusing to cry out. She wanted him to see her capable, resourceful, not fragile, not frightened. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. The scrape of linen against skin was the only sound. He examined the cut, his fingers calloused but careful. Deep enough to draw blood, he stated, his voice a low rumble. But clean. Lucky. Lucky? She hadn't felt particularly lucky. She'd felt foolish, determined to prove herself. And now she'd only succeeded in adding another task to Silas's already heavy burden. He began to bind the wound, his movements methodical. He didn't wrap it tightly, didn't impede circulation. He knew what he was doing. He'd seen enough injuries in his life. Her gaze traced the lines on his face, the deep creases around his eyes, the weathered skin, the stubborn set of his jaw. He rarely smiled, rarely offered comfort. But there was a quiet strength in his presence, a steadfastness that she found herself drawn to. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something else. A feeling of safety, of being seen, not as a burden, but as something worthy of care. He finished binding the wound, securing it with a knot. He didn't offer a word of praise, didn't pat her hand. He simply looked at her, his eyes assessing. "See to it you keep that clean," he said, his voice gruff. "And avoid sharp objects." She nodded, her throat tight. She couldn't meet his gaze. The warmth in her chest intensified, spreading through her limbs. It was foolish to feel this way. He was just being practical, just tending to an injury. But it felt like more. And she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near. The scent shifted. Not the dry, sun-baked earth, nor the sweet scent of sage. This was acrid, metallic, fear, and horse sweat. Malik tasted it on the back of his tongue before he saw them. 3 riders, emerging from the wash like wraiths, rifles leveled. "Outlaws! Down!" he barked, shoving Alara behind him. The mare, startled by his sudden movement, whinnied and stumbled, nearly unseating him. He managed to keep her upright, his hand instinctively tightening on the reins, but the precious seconds lost were almost a death sentence. A rifle cracked. Dust exploded at their feet. Malik returned fire, squeezing off 2 quick shots before dropping to one knee, using the mare as a partial shield. She shuddered, ears flattened against her head. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice tight with urgency. Alara didn't hesitate. She pressed herself into the dirt, her body trembling. But she didn't scream, didn't flinch beyond the initial jolt of the first shot whistling past her ear. He risked a glance. She wasn't looking at him, wasn't pleading for help. She was watching the outlaws, her gaze assessing, calculating. Another shot ripped through the air, grazing Malik's arm. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the searing pain. The mare, panicked by the gunfire, reared, throwing him off balance. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Everything seemed to slow. The acrid smell of gunpowder, the thunder of hooves, the outlaws closing in. He saw one dismount, leveling his rifle directly at Alara. Without thinking, she snatched up the discarded rifle he'd dropped in the chaos. Her hands, usually clumsy and hesitant, moved with a sudden, unfamiliar precision. She didn't aim for the rider. She aimed for his horse. A single shot, and the animal screamed, collapsing in a heap, throwing the outlaw to the ground. Malik used the distraction to scramble to his feet, firing a shot that forced the remaining outlaws to take cover. He hadn't realized how much his arm throbbed until he squeezed the trigger again. The pain was blinding, but he forced himself to stay focused. They exchanged fire for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with smoke and the smell of burnt powder. Malik, wounded and exhausted, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. But it was Alara who surprised him. She wasn't the fragile girl he'd found huddled beside her father's wagon. She moved with a newfound agility, reloading her rifle with a speed that belied her inexperience, taking cover behind rocks and brush, returning fire with deadly accuracy. Finally, with a frustrated yell, the remaining outlaws spurred their horses and fled. Silence descended, broken only by the mare's ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. Malik leaned against a boulder, his body aching, his arms stained with blood. He watched Alara lower her rifle, her chest heaving, her face smudged with dirt and gunpowder. She hadn't cried. She hadn't panicked. She'd fought. He hadn't known she possessed such strength, such cold, calculating resolve. He touched his arm gingerly. It would need tending. But it wasn't his wounds that concerned him. It was the realization that the girl he'd taken under his wing was gone. Something had changed within her, forged in the heat of battle. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was different. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his. They were no longer filled with fear, but with a quiet, steely determination. The pale, fragile girl was gone. A warrior stood in her place. The scent of pine and wood smoke mingled with the metallic tang of blood, though it was lessening now. Alara moved with a quiet diligence, her fingers surprisingly gentle as she swabbed at the gash on his arm. He hadn't realized how much the fight had drained him, not just physically, but emotionally. He watched her, the pale curve of her jaw, the focused intensity in her gray eyes. She hadn't spoken much since they'd limped back to the cabin, her energy channeled entirely into tending his wounds. He winced as she touched a particularly sensitive spot. "Sorry," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. She didn't meet his gaze, her attention fixed on the task at hand. He grunted, a sound that could mean anything. It wasn't just the pain. Seeing her fight, watching that fragile frame stand firm against the outlaws, it had shaken something loose inside him. Something he thought long buried. Get out there," he finally managed, the words rough around the edges. She paused, her hand hovering over the bandage. "I didn't want to be a burden." "A burden?" He raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement touching his lips. "You saved my hide. More than once." She lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushing a delicate pink. I didn't have a choice. I couldn't just stand there." He let the silence stretch between them, watching the play of emotions on her face. The fragile girl he'd initially taken in was gone. Not entirely, perhaps, but something new had blossomed within her. Something wild, untamed. He'd seen it in the way she'd handled the rifle, in the steely glint in her eyes. "Your father, he shouldn't have tried to cross in storm season," he said, his voice gruff. It felt inadequate, a harsh practicality in the face of her loss. But offering soft words felt false. Alara stiffened, her grip tightening on the cloth. He was trying to reach the gold fields. He thought he could make a new life for us. A new life. He knew that dream all too well. He'd chased it himself, years ago, only to find that some wounds never healed. "It's a hard country," he said softly, his voice losing its edge. "It takes more than courage to survive." She finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his face. "You've survived." He shifted uncomfortably. "I've been lucky. And I had help. People who believed in me." He hadn't realized how long it had been since he'd spoken those words. How much he'd walled himself off from connection. "You're a strong man, Malik," she said, her voice low. He snorted. Strong enough to get shot at. He hadn't felt this vulnerable in years. Not even after losing his brother. This felt different. It was the weight of responsibility, perhaps. or the unsettling realization that he was starting to care for this girl. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on his face, a quiet understanding passing between them. She finished bandaging his arm, her touch surprisingly sure. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, studying him. "Tell me about your brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He hadn't spoken about Liam in years. It was too painful, but something in her gaze, a gentle empathy, a quiet acceptance, loosened the knot in his chest. He closed his eyes, the memory of his brother vivid in his mind. He was everything I wasn't. A charmer, a storyteller. He could make anyone laugh. He paused, a wry smile touching his lips. He always said I was too serious. He spoke for a long time, sharing stories of his brother, of their childhood, of the dreams they'd shared. Alara listened intently, offering no judgment, no interruption. It was as if her presence had unlocked something within him, allowing him to finally grieve. And in turn, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a shared understanding of loss, of resilience. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding on to, how much he'd needed to speak his grief aloud. As he finished his story, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. He opened his eyes and met her gaze. The fragile girl was still there, but something else had emerged. A quiet strength, a determined spirit. And in that moment, he knew that their journey was just beginning. The scent of wood smoke and tanned hide clung to the air, a comforting balm against the ever-present wind. Alara smoothed the final stitch on the vest, her fingers, once clumsy, now moving with practiced ease. It wasn't perfect, the seams weren't quite as even as Silas's work, but it was solid, functional, and undeniably hers. A warmth bloomed in her chest, not just from the exertion, but from a burgeoning sense of accomplishment. This wasn't the fragile girl who'd huddled in blankets after the storm. This was someone who could make something, protect against the cold, provide for herself. She turned, holding out the vest to Silas. He hadn't asked for anything, hadn't offered praise for her smaller efforts, a mended tear in his coat, a successfully snared rabbit. His acknowledgement came in the form of tasks, of increasing responsibility. This felt different. He took the vest, his calloused fingers tracing the seams. His gaze lingered on the intricate beadwork she'd added, a simple pattern of wildflowers, mirroring the ones that stubbornly bloomed even on the harshest stretches of the prairie. His lips, usually pressed into a firm line, softened almost imperceptibly. He didn't speak, but the subtle widening of his eyes, the brief, almost hesitant touch of his hand on her arm as he inspected the work, spoke volumes. It wasn't effusive praise, but it was his approval, and it felt more precious than any grand compliment. "Practical," he finally rumbled, his voice gravelly. "Warm. You did well." A slow smile touched Alara's lips. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. More than enough. She'd expected acknowledgement of the craftsmanship, but the way his gaze kept returning to her face, not the vest, sent a different kind of warmth radiating through her. A flush rose on her cheeks. "I thought, perhaps I could make something for the winter," she said, her voice a little breathless. "Gloves. A heavier coat. We'll see," Silas replied, turning to hang the vest on a peg by the door. He moved with a stiffness she hadn't noticed before. A shadow fell across the cabin entrance. Alara turned to see a man standing there, framed by the fading light. He was handsome, undeniably so, with dark, curling hair and a smile that could charm the birds from the trees. She'd seen him at the trading post a few times. Caleb, the trapper who always had a full pack and a quick wit. "Evening, Silas," Caleb greeted, his gaze drifting past the older man to settle on Alara. His smile broadened, revealing even white teeth. "And a particularly lovely evening it is. I was hoping to borrow your horse for a quick run to the creek. Heard there's a fresh spring there." Silas's jaw tightened. "Horse is tired. Used him hard today." Caleb's smile didn't falter. He turned his attention back to Alara, his eyes lingering a moment longer than necessary. "That's a remarkable vest, Miss Alara. I heard you fashioned it yourself. Truly exceptional work. A woman with such skill is a rare find on the plains." Alara's fingers tightened around the edge of the work table. The compliment, so freely given, felt off, different from Silas's tacit acknowledgement. "Thank you," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. Caleb took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "I've been admiring your work for some time now. Your stitching is precise, artistic. I was hoping, perhaps, you might consider crafting me a saddlebag. Something unique." He paused, offering a disarming smile. "I'm willing to pay handsomely, of course." Silas hadn't moved, but Alara could feel his gaze boring into Caleb's back. The air in the cabin, once warm and comforting, had grown thick, charged with a tension that prickled her skin. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him. This wasn't simply a request for craftsmanship. It was something else entirely. Something possessive. Something challenging. The necklace felt cold against her skin, a jarring contrast to the warmth radiating from the hearth. Caleb had insisted, draping it over her neck with a practiced ease that sent a shiver down Alara's spine. Turquoise and silver, intricately woven, beautiful, undeniably. But it felt wrong, like a cage for her throat. "It suits you," Caleb said, his gaze lingering a beat too long on the line of her jaw. "Brings out the color in your eyes." Alara instinctively reached for the clasp, her fingers fumbling with the delicate mechanism. "It's very generous of you, Mr. Calloway." "Caleb, please." He leaned closer, the scent of pine and wood smoke filling her nostrils. "And generosity isn't about expecting anything in return, Miss Alara. Just wanting to see a wildflower bloom." The words felt coated in something she couldn't name. Possession, perhaps. The notion settled in her stomach like a stone. She managed a tight smile, finally working the clasp free. The necklace fell into her palm, heavy and unwanted. "It's lovely," she said, placing it carefully on the work table beside a half-finished saddlebag. "But I rarely wear jewelry." Silas hadn't spoken since Caleb's arrival, but Alara could feel his gaze. A steady, unwavering weight. He stood near the roughly hewn logs that formed one wall of the cabin, arms crossed, silently sizing up Caleb. His jaw was tight, a muscle ticked beneath the skin of his cheek. It wasn't an inviting posture. "A practical woman," Caleb said, his voice smooth as polished river stone. He turned his attention to the saddlebag, running a calloused thumb over the intricate stitching. "This is exceptional work, truly. You have a gift, Miss Alara. A rare talent. Silas taught me," she offered quickly, wanting to deflect the attention. "He's a skilled craftsman." Caleb's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed, a man of the mountains. But even a seasoned craftsman needs a keen eye for detail, a delicate touch. Something you clearly possess." He turned back to her, his gaze sweeping over her face, assessing. A flush crept up Alara's neck. She busied herself with a strip of leather, pretending to examine it for flaws. She hadn't expected this relentless attention. She'd assumed Caleb's interest stemmed from her work, from the practical skills she was developing. But it felt different now, more invasive. Silas finally spoke, his voice a low rumble that cut through the polite chatter. "The leather's from a bull elk, taken near the Black Hills. A tough hide to work with." Caleb barely glanced at him. "Impressive. You've clearly taught her well." He turned his full attention back to Alara. "I have a mare, a spirited creature. Needs a new saddlebag, something truly unique. Perhaps we could discuss a commission?" "I'm prepared to pay handsomely, naturally," Alara stammered. I'm already quite busy with current projects." "Nonsense." Caleb's smile widened, revealing a flash of white teeth. "A talented artist shouldn't be kept waiting. Besides," he lowered his voice, leaning closer, "I believe we could come to a mutually beneficial arrangement." Alara's fingers tightened around the leather strip, the rough texture digging into her skin. She risked a glance at Silas, searching for what? Approval? Rescue? He hadn't moved, but his eyes burned with a cold fury. A silent warning. This wasn't a request. This was a claim. The air crackled, not with the promise of a storm, but with a tension thicker than the dust that coated everything. Caleb hadn't formally departed, but his pointed silence felt like a dismissal, a cold brand against her skin. Silas hadn't moved either, his gaze locked on Caleb's, retreating back until the man was a shadow swallowed by the darkness. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned to her. It wasn't a triumphant look, not a possessive glare. It was weariness, a deep, bone-aching weariness that mirrored the lines etched around his eyes, the slump in his broad shoulders. He hadn't intended for Caleb to see this, the raw, unshielded vulnerability he usually kept buried beneath layers of stoicism. He didn't speak immediately. He simply reached out, his calloused hand hovering for a moment before gently cupping the side of her face. The leather of his glove was worn smooth, the touch surprisingly tender. Her skin felt cool beneath his, a fragile contrast to the heat radiating from his palm. I misjudged you, Alara. His voice was rough, gravelly, as if enused to gentleness. I thought you were a burden, a responsibility, something to be managed. She swallowed, the lump in her throat constricting her breath. The admission, however clumsy, resonated with a truth she'd sensed beneath his gruff exterior. He hadn't sought her out. He hadn't offered comfort. He'd simply acted. Out of duty. You weren't wrong. At first, she managed, her voice barely a whisper. I was a burden. I didn't know how to do anything. I was just trying to survive. He lowered his thumb, tracing the line of her jaw with a surprising lightness. You did more than survive. You adapted. You learned. You made a life here. And somewhere along the way, he paused, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising to meet her eyes, a flicker of something dark and unfamiliar swirling within their depths. Somewhere along the way, you became everything I didn't know I needed. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the vast silence of the plain. She'd imagined his touch in her dreams, fleeting moments of warmth and protection. But this was different. This was real. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling as she reached up to rest against his cheek. The stubble scratched against her skin, a grounding sensation. She could feel the heat of his skin, the subtle tremor in his jaw. I didn't expect, she began, then stopped, unable to articulate the whirlwind of emotions churning within her. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against her forehead, a soft, hesitant touch that sent shivers down her spine. I didn't either. Then, he tilted his head and kissed her. Not a forceful claiming, but a tentative exploration. A gentle pressing of lips against lips, a soft sigh escaping his throat. The kiss tasted of wood smoke, leather, and something uniquely him. She responded, hesitantly at first, then with a growing warmth. The kiss deepened, her fingers tangling in the rough strands of his hair. It wasn't a reckless, youthful passion. It was a deep, abiding connection forged in hardship and solitude. A recognition of something profound and lasting. He pulled back slightly, his breath warm against her cheek. I'm not a man of many words, Alara. Never have been. He traced the curve of her lips with his thumb. But I want you to know, I care for you. More than I ever thought possible. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. The vastness of the plain faded away, replaced by the comforting weight of his arms around her. I care for you too, Silas. The words felt fragile, yet utterly true. I think I've loved you for a long time. The wind whispered across the plain, carrying the scent of sage and pine. Overhead, the stars blazed with a cold, unwavering light. They stood there, locked in a silent embrace, two souls bound together by a love as wild and untamed as the land that surrounded them. A love forged in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to everything. Silas tested the fit of a mortise and tenon, the rasp of wood against wood a familiar comfort. Beside him, Alara smoothed the rough-hewn surface of a wall stud, her touch surprisingly assured. Not the hesitant, fragile girl he'd found huddled beside her father's wagon. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms browned by the Wyoming sun, and a smattering of sawdust dusted her cheekbones. He didn't need to look at her eyes to see the change. It was etched into the set of her shoulders, the confident swing of the hammer, the way she anticipated his needs without a word. He glanced up, catching her gaze. A slow smile curved her lips, and a warmth spread through him, settling somewhere deep in his chest, a place long dormant, long shielded. Building this cabin wasn't just about shelter. It was about laying a foundation for something new, something lasting, something shared. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding his breath, bracing against disappointment, until this moment. "This timber is good," Elara said, her voice steady. "Stronger than the ones we found near the creek." He agreed, running a calloused hand over the wood. "Took some finding. Needed to be. He didn't save for you. He didn't need to." Every beam raised, every nail hammered, was a testament to his commitment. She stepped back, surveying their progress. It's starting to feel like a home." He allowed himself a small smile. He hadn't allowed himself to think of it as such, not yet. "A roof over our heads, at least." "More than that," she insisted, and he turned back to the task at hand, willing his hands to remain steady. He'd spent years building walls around his heart, convinced solitude was all he was capable of. She hadn't broken those walls down. She'd simply walked around them, filling the space with light. Later, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they worked in companionable silence. Elara, with surprising strength, hauled a crossbeam into place, her muscles straining. Silas steadied the timber, his hands brushing against hers. A jolt, unexpected and thrilling, ran through him. He held her gaze, and she didn't look away. "I had a good teacher," she said softly, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. He chuckled, a sound rough from disuse. You learn quickly." He paused, then added, "You've become remarkable, Elara." She leaned against him, her weight a comforting pressure. "And you, Silas? Are you happy?" He hadn't allowed himself to consider the question, hadn't dared to hope. But looking at her, at the cabin taking shape around them, at the promise of a future unfolding before them, he knew the answer. "More than I ever thought possible." The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. It wasn't just a cabin rising from the earth. It was a home, a future, a life forged in the heart of the Wyoming wilderness, built on a foundation of shared strength, unwavering loyalty, and a love that bloomed in the most unexpected of places. A love that, finally, felt like coming home.